My name is Drew Waldron, and I am on with educator, researcher, and activist Jeff Duncan-Andrade. Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Now, Jeff, you started your career as an educator in underprivileged communities, and further down the line, it led you to founding a community school and founding an education group. What was your experience like at the very start of your career, and how has it led you to where you are now?
I started teaching in Oakland, California when I was 20 years old. I couldn't even buy a drink, which I often needed after my early teaching days. When I started, I think I was like a lot of young and committed and hopeful educators in that I thought that what was missing in schools like the ones where I taught and the ones where I grew up in was teachers like me, right? And I would once I got there, then, things would get better. What I quickly realized was that that wasn't the solution, that there was something deeper going on inside of the school system and the institutions of public schools that was so deeply flawed and deeply committed to being reproductive of those same patterns. That really then helped me to understand really two things. One, just how hard teaching is. And I think that there's a sort of national misunderstanding about just how challenging and complex it is to show up every day as a classroom teacher and be effective. Have spent the last 30 years of my life really trying to bang on my craft and honor the incredible educators that are in our school systems right now and the best educators that I had in my life. Because what I learned as a teacher is just how much work they had to put in to be able to be effective with me and my peers.
What advice do you find yourself giving educators the most in 2025, specifically around defining success academically?
I spend a lot of my time, one, asking educators and school systems to fundamentally rethink why they do what they do. Like, I don't feel like there's enough purpose conversation. So, and what that means is that we presume that the purpose that we have designed for our public school system in this country is the right one and that it's a good one. And I challenge that notion. I think the purpose of public education that we currently maintain and uphold in this country is flawed. And that's why we get the results that we continue to get and sort of wring our hands over, oh, gosh, again, like, and I think that has to do with us not really examining the foundation of the project. And so the way I talk about this with educators is I ask them, I just did a talk in Tacoma a couple days ago, right? And I asked the audience, I said, how many of you own homes? 60% of the people raise their hand. It kind of regionally depends on where I'm at, because if I'm in California, like 5% of the people raise their hands. But whatever, people raise their hands. And I say, okay, well, when you bought your home, what was the first thing you had inspected? And of course, people shout out foundation, the foundation. And I asked him, I said, well, why'd you have the foundation inspected? Why didn't you check the double pane windows or the HVAC system or the new roof or the state-of-the-art kitchen or the hardwood floors? Why do you start with the foundation? And they say, because if we invest in all those other things and we don't have a solid foundation, then we're just throwing good money after bad. And that is what I think is happening in our public education system, that we have a foundational problem. And so a lot of the work I do first is to have people like revisit, what is the purpose of this project? Like, why do we take children from their families by law for 13 consecutive years for 6 to 7 hours a day? Why do we do that? Right? And let's start there. And then whatever our answer is to that, then let's make sure that our school day, our curriculum, our budget, our pedagogy, our assessments match that purpose. And I think that the reason that teachers are often so discontented and so like off balance is because their purpose, which I think is often a right and righteous one, is often misaligned with the institutional purpose of public schools, which is often, right, not about developing critically, civically engaged democratic citizens. It's not about developing problem solvers and critical thinkers. It's not about developing young people that are well like well inside themselves, but also well as community members. And what it is about is often it's about developing compliance, right? It's about developing a sort of pathway into your career or your profession. And I'm not against any of those, but those should not be the core foundational purposes of a public education system in a pluralistic multiracial democracy. And so we've gotten out of balance, right, on the things that we prioritize in schools. And we've kind of chased down that rabbit hole under the auspices that this is going to lead to greater academic rigor and success. And there is no data that suggests that that's happening, right? In fact, the data suggests the opposite is happening. And because like I really value research and data as a way to inform and drive the kinds of things that I'm prioritizing as a practitioner, but also as somebody who has the opportunity to influence the national discussion.
Well said. Very, very well said. Jeff, you've been spreading all of these great ideals and great messages through your teaching, your speaking. So I have a very broad question for you. What is next? What projects do you have on the horizon?
When we opened the Roses and Concrete Community School, we were very transparent about that we were going to apply the research that I've just sort of been discussing, right? Like we were going to make real a fundamental shift in the purpose of our practice. And we did that. Like anybody who came there, like you can ask anybody who came to that school, they will tell you, like, I've never seen anything like this before. This is fundamentally different and it's special. But what we quickly realized was that we didn't have the metrics to actually measure the impacts that we were seeking. And so that led me on a project with a whole collaborative project with people from around the country. And at the time, I was a member of a group that I helped to found called the Community Responsive Education Group. So it was a group of us in that, and then a group of national scholars, some of the leading researchers in neuroscience and pediatrics and child psychology. And we started really trying to understand, like, can you measure wellness? Can you measure the degree to which a young person is more well for having spent 7 hours with you during that day? And all of these researchers, right, across all of those fields were like, yeah, you can. And so we went to work on a multi-year project to unpack that. Like what first, like what is wellness, right? Because like who's against wellness? Like nobody's against wellness. Everybody thinks they're for wellness, but they can't actually tell you what wellness is. Or you might get this sort of like myriad of responses. So we wanted to get some clarity around, well, what do we actually know in the research and practice about what wellness consists of? And then how do you measure that? Right? And so we ended up coming out of this project, we created the first of its kind Youth Wellness Index, which is a tool that can actually measure the well-being of young people and look at how it's changing over time. I knew this intuitively probably as long as I've taught. What this project helped to do was to flush out for me the research that really then helped me understand why schools struggle so much to use data to drive change. What I realized in doing this project is that the reason that schools haven't figured out how to use data to drive change is because they're looking at the wrong data. So they're looking at reading scores, right? They're looking at math scores. They're looking at attendance. They're looking at infractions with the discipline policy. And then they're letting that outcome data shape the changes that they want to make so that they can get the outcome data that they want. And if you talk to any like systems engineer, they'll tell you like that ain't gonna work because you can't use outcome data to drive process change. You have to have process. So if you don't get the outcomes you want, then you know there's something wrong with your process, right? It's the process that you have to change. But if you don't have any process data, then you guess. You're like, oh, well, let's change this process, right? And that's effectively what happens in schools. We don't like our reading scores, so we guess why those kids didn't get good reading scores. And sometimes you guess right, and then the reading scores go up. But then you can't figure out the next step, like how they went up, but how do we make them go up more? Because you don't actually know. So what the research around those other fields tells us is that those, and if you talk to a psychometrician, right, this is why psychometricians kind of roll their eyes at how schools approach change, because they actually understand, right, data, right, and they understand psychometrics. And what they'll tell you is that what we measure in schools are lag indicators of youth development. But what we need to look at is what are the leading indicators of youth development? Because if you move the meter on the leading indicators, then the lag indicators change. And that's what we realize at Roses is we don't have a leading indicator metric. And what is the leading indicator? It's well-being. Like kids that are not well, I don't care what curriculum you use, right? If the young person is not well, then they're not going to thrive in school. But if you can turn those investments to really understand how do we take this young person from wherever they are, and day after day after day, they're getting a little bit more well because they're with us. What we see in the research is that when practitioners do that, guess what happens to test scores? They go up. Guess what happens to reading? It goes up, right? It's not rocket science, right? It's intuitive, but the reason that schools can't do this consistently is because they don't have the tool to measure the leading indicators of youth development, which is the Youth Wellness Index. So our next project is to take this index that we've gotten validated, that we've tested with thousands of students all over the country, and to take it to a school that is raising its hand and saying, we want to repurpose ourselves. We want to redo our foundation with a centralized focus on youth wellness. We don't want to have a wellness center. We want to be the center of wellness in kids' lives. The next project is to identify that school and engage in a 5-year practice-based research project to study what does it take to rip up the foundation and repurpose a school to fundamentally center wellness. How does that track over time, right, in our data metrics, right? How do kids get more well, and how do they get more well? And what is the corollary response of the other measures, which we absolutely care about? Like, I want my sons to do well on tests. I want my sons to read and write and do math and do science. I do. But I also know that my sons will not do that at any sort of high level if they are not well. So what we want to see now is what happens when an entire institution acknowledges that and reshapes and reforms itself to that end. And then how does that impact test scores, right? How does that impact attendance, right? How does that impact behavior? And then how can we use that leading indicator data, that wellness data, to then shift and adjust and modify for each kid? So my last comment on this is that part of that work is sort of appropriating. If you go into schools, they use something called an IEP. It's an acronym for an individualized education plan. And it's typically for kids who are in special ed or have like special like learning or emotional needs. What we are talking about doing is that every kid in a US public school should have an IWP. Every kid should have an individual wellness plan. Because if we're working that plan and adjusting and responding that plan, and they're consistently getting more well, everything we see in the research and everything we know in practice is that they're going to start doing better in school.
Wow. Thank you so much for breaking that down for us, Jeff. Jeff, we have time for one more question, and it's very open-ended. I'm interested to hear your take. You and I are currently filming this conversation in the middle of April 2025. The Trump administration has had the Department of Education in the news constantly. What is your reaction to the contentious coverage of the Department of Education? What's your gut reaction? What do you think the future holds?
It's scary, right? But I also, like, if I've learned anything over my 30 years, these are moments of opportunity, right? If we can sort of set aside our fear and start thinking about, okay, how do we leverage this to move forward in a good way? Okay, because at some level, like, there's some truth to the fact that, like, what we are doing in public schools, whether you're talking about at the state level or the federal level, it's not working. It is not working. And the lack of honesty and transparency and the absence of real, like, rage and discontent about that from our national leaders is and has been very troubling to me for a long, long time. I feel like that the only way that you create like real transformation is by starting with telling the truth. I don't think that that's what's happening right now. Like I don't there's just sort of lies on top of lies on top of lies, and that's not the path forward. And so what troubles me about this approach is that it's about tearing down, not about building up. And I don't come from that. Like I come from builders, right? Like I want to build. And I haven't heard anything from the administration about what they're saying to build. Now, this idea that they're going to punt back to states, I'm not necessarily against that. Like I want more local control. I don't want it at the state level. Like I want it at the community level. I think there should be much greater autonomy at the community level to determine what the priorities are for the children that are there. And so there's some potential there. Like if we, right, and the truth is that there's nothing in the US Constitution that guarantees a free public education. It's not a constitutional right, it's a state's right. There's some logic there to me, but the way in which the logic is unfolding is illogical, it's ill-informed, and it's dangerous because what is on the table is really key resources going to language learners, going to special ed, going to the most vulnerable, going to girls and women. They're talking about ripping that budget away. I haven't heard them say, we're not throwing that money away, right? We're going to turn that over to the states and let them make decisions. So if what they're proposing happens, you're going to see a massive catastrophe in public schools because public schools are already severely underfunded in this country compared to some of our like global, right, rivals or competitors, right, that actually prioritize public education in a much more meaningful way. So we're already, right, you're already watching schools, right, struggle to make things work, particularly schools that, I mean, part of the troubles of this nation is that we've built a school system where those who have the most get the most, and those who have the least get the least. So schools are not the great equalizer, right? They're the great engine for social reproduction. If you take away the federal resources, which aren't a huge part of school districts' budget, but they're big enough and focused enough on the most vulnerable populations that if you take that away, schools are in trouble. And I don't say that like lightly, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. Like this will create massive problems in our public school system. And it's going to be hard to walk that back. You know, a lot of what has come out of this administration has been a lot of shock and awe. And, you know, that's sort of their like modus operandi. If there is going to be a shakeup in a DOE, from this administration or any administration, I want to hear first the truth about why. Then I want to hear, well, what's the plan? So that, because if it doesn't have to be this way or it isn't working this way, then what are you proposing? So just pouring gasoline and torching it, that's not a proposition, right? That's shock and awe. That's utter destruction. And that is not what our children and our teachers and our communities need. We need a plan. And until I hear a plan that is actually research based and data driven, then I don't know how to respond to it because they don't have a plan.
Well said. Absolutely. I think we can only hope for the best, you know? Well, Jeff, that is going to conclude our conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.